and where I'm coming from. But I guess the question, one question to help direct this is, does John imagine Jesus pre-existing his human career? And if so, in what state, or what did he pre-exist as?
Okay. Yeah. Well, as a Johannine scholar, I'm trying to read from the first century rather than back from the 21st century or the 4th century or whatever. So this ontological question, I don't think John gives us much to work with.
Right.
And in saying that, I don't think this is at all interesting to John. He's interested. The two titles, Son of God, Son of Man, are really critical.
And Christ.
Yeah. It is quite clear what Jesus' role is in coming. The question is, where's the authority for that role? And that is grounded in this pre-existence. Right? And John moves to a metaphoric answer to your question. What is Jesus? Where is he? He's with God in this heavenly space, watching God work and learning from God by working alongside God. So it makes me think of all those Sunday school pictures of Jesus in Joseph's workshop, sawing wood with Joseph, with all sorts of medieval tools. And in some ways, I always disparage that image, but I think it's an important image because this is what Jesus is doing. This is ancient education, but it's also what gives him authority, because this is an economy where you inherit your father's role, you inherit your father's status, and a good son who is the agent of the father has to be respected, because to ignore the authority of the son is to ignore the authority of the father. And so this is really what he's doing, is he knows what God's intent is. He knows how God works, knows God's interested in creation and life, has the authority to judge. And these all come from the Father. And so we have much more of a spatial view with heaven and earth, or heaven and the world, above and below sort of language, but we have to treat that metaphorically, because they knew that this is a metaphoric language to describe something that our human minds can't quite comprehend.
So you're depicting Jesus as something like the apprentice, the loyal and faithful apprentice of God.
Yeah. So yeah. So but this is, it's not mythology in that John doesn't present us with the sort of stories of Jesus misbehaving. We have those stories of Jesus misbehaving,
right,
as the human son,
that
are, answer the question, what would it be like to have divine powers and be 5 years old?
Right, the making clay birds and having them attack the other kids, right?
There's, I'm gonna pause, reset my thoughts for a second. So that's where I tend to focus, is at what do the metaphors give us about Jesus' identity? Why did they work? Why were they compelling in that context? And and then how they then inform the way we think of him now. And I think also in terms of, when we talk about him and God and his capacity to reveal God, there is this knowing aspect, and it's God's intent. He knows God's intent. And it's not, God has told me to say this to you. These are what, he knows what that means. He knows what the plan is. He knows. Yeah. So he knows what it's about.
And that's what the language of I'm in the Father and the Father is in me and I and the Father are one, that's the sort of thing that's trying to be communicated by those sorts of passages.
Yeah. And the unity language is so important. And we see it in Paul and we see it in John. And so here we see, the milieu in which both of them are operating is in the unity of the Father and Son is critical.
Yeah.
And in part, it's that how does Christianity understand how it is related to the Old Testament and Judaism, and how can it argue that it is in continuity, that it isn't something new or different, that it's part of this original intent that God had to send his Son and to then broaden the covenant to all people. It's, there's lots of places where it can dip into the Old Testament, but when you have this figure of Jesus giving life and acting as judge, these are two divine prerogatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus is then ontologically, as in his being, is divine. And that opens up the question, well, then is he created? Is he, is there an apotheosis? Does he become divine? And John says, no, he always has been. He always was. This isn't something developmental. This is perfect unity with God. And in part, I think it is their way of getting out of the accusation that you're creating two gods. Mm-hmm. And so we have the building blocks or the development of a Trinitarian tradition that is inchoate, it's in progress.
Sure. So does the Gospel of John have a different view of who God is than the Jewish setting around him? Because it seems like of all the different things that they argue about, kind of the nature or identity of God doesn't seem to be one of the things under dispute in the gospel. How you get to God, how you know God, what God is up to, who he is working in and who he is not working in, those are the disputes. But in terms of there being one true God, that doesn't seem to be on the table of dispute.
Yeah. How you be in relationship with God is the question. And in Judaism, you're in relationship with God by fulfilling the Torah. Mm-hmm. And that brings a sort of an intimacy with God. Prayer,
the temple cult.
Ritual, yeah. So all of these things are bringing this relationship with God, and the Gospel of John says, no, that there's a greater intimacy and a truer intimacy that happens when you're in relationship with Jesus. Because he and God are like this, and so to know the Son is to know the Father. And it is about, when we talk about knowing in both Judaism and in John, I think they are on the same page in that they're talking about relationship. It is being in relationship with God is what this knowledge is really about. And that relationship is characterized by love. It's characterized by joy. And both of those things are very Jewish. And yeah.
Right. So
what John doesn't stress as much is the righteousness. And you know, if he knows Matthew and Luke, then he's, oh, they've covered that. I don't need to do that. I'm dealing with this other part.
Right. And in the letters, in the Johannine epistles, he deals a little bit more with behavior and loving community and that sort of thing, and doing the commands that you've received and stuff like that. But in the gospel, that isn't a prominent theme. So I guess, so it seems to me like there are only seemingly 2 times in the gospel where the word God might be referring to Jesus. The other times, all the other uses of the word God are just the Father. And when Jesus is talking with the Jews about God, there isn't seemingly any confusion about who's being talked with. The question is you need to get to him through me now or not. So to me, it still is unclear to me what exactly John imagines Jesus as, in a way that doesn't break the monotheism.
Yeah. Well, and I think he's looking at this sort of through the lens of the Shema. So we have in the Shema that unity between God and the community by loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might. Now I'm getting mixed up with version of it. This is a deficit of my education, biblical education. Never got good at rolling scripture off my lips. But in any case, that unity that is so critical in the Shema, which is so critical to the Jewish identity, gets played with. It gets played with a lot in Paul, and it also seems to be in the hinterground for John as well. And so this sort of oneness that he's aiming at is about intent, more than about being. It's just not that kind of speculative theology in John. But I think that John does give us enough to say, like, I have trouble wrapping my head around any Trinitarian articulation at times. But the basic concept that all of these are working together to the same end, and that if the Spirit is moving you, then that's what God's intent is. Because the Spirit isn't going to deceive. And I think that's sort of our understanding of, how these 3 things work together. And yeah, it's not, if we think about other incarnational theologies, it's not the same as Krishna. You have Vishnu, and Vishnu incarnates as Krishna, and Krishna doesn't then talk to Vishnu and ask him for advice or guidance or pray to him or talk about him as other than himself. So there's no emptying himself of Vishnu or becoming something separate. In John, we have this image. It's not that God sort of dislocates a part of himself and as an emanation of God, but you have this representation then of this community, this household of God. And that's not un-Jewish, in that it's a very crowded heaven in Judaism. We think Protestants tend to have sort of emptied heaven a little bit too much for it to be truly biblical.
Yeah.
Just got up there, and there's a lot more going on up there
in their imagination. Yeah.
In their imagination, and so, but what is being made clear is that Jesus is truly unique and truly, for all time, absolutely in authority, without doubt. And so you can be totally confident. There's the absolute. The rhetorical aim is to feel this unwavering sense of confidence that Jesus' word is good and that Jesus is the means by which salvation is achieved. And
right. So
yeah.
So I have another question that kind of gets into this is, do you think that John imagines that we believers will become what Jesus is? That Jesus is kind of like Jesus is that idea of him as our forerunner or the first fruit of the dead or something like that, where we, through faith, we become one with Jesus just as him and the Father are one, like Jesus prays, or that we are in him and he is in us, and Jesus is in the Father, right? Like those prayers seem to suggest that the goal is to bring us into the same sort of unity that Jesus has, and that we become what Jesus is. Do you think that's
I
in
don't
John's
think
mind?
it goes that far. I can see how one could push it that far, but I think the line is still drawn between Jesus and God on this side, and Jesus the only Son, and we are children of God, but we never usurp that Son's role in this picture. And I think the representation of the disciples is sort of critical to this, because they just are bumbling all the way through to the bitter end. And they're never represented as attaining any sort of perfection whatsoever. And so I think that perfectibility of there isn't a perfection of human being in the Judeo and the Christian traditions. The perfection of our faith sort of language is more the telos of our faith, the fulfillment of our faith, coming to completion, not that at the end of the day, we are in some ways that we have this perfect attunement with God. I don't think it presents that sort of picture at all. And I think it saves us from that with the representation of the disciples as comical characters all the way through.
And that's part of what you think is meant by monogenes,